Hey guys, so today I have my October wrap up for you. The first book I completed in October was Pet Sematary by Stephen King, and I did a buddy read of this with my friend Yasmin from Yasmin the Reader. We both loved this and smashed it out in a day. I went into this book with the assumption that it was about this family whose cat died and this cat comes back from the dead. And it is about that, but it's so much more. I was surprised by how much of a lack of plot there was in this book, but it wasn't a bad thing. I was also expecting it to be a lot more horrifying in a really gory way, and it wasn't. It was just consistently really eerie and creepy. I would say it's more of a psychological horror than a gory horror. This book was really interesting, the way the characters were kind of relatable. The choices they made, you knew they were the wrong choices because it's a Stephen King novel and you know that bad stuff's gonna happen and you want to tell them to stop, but if you were put in their position, I think you would have made the same choices. That's where I think it was so horrifying. I think I gave it a 4.5 stars in the end. It was really enjoyable. I don't want to say too much because it really is one of those books that you have to read and discover for yourself, then you will feel the impact of it. I then reread two of my favorite books, and they are Mistborn and The Well of Ascension, both by Brandon Sanderson. These are fantastic. Like, where do I even begin to tell you about these books? They are definitely the adult fantasy I see talked about most on BookTube. It's for really good reasons. I think these are so popular because of how accessible they are, but also because they are so similar in some sense to so much of the other fantasy that's really popular on BookTube, particularly the YA fantasy. We are following this young girl who is an orphan and she's growing up on the streets, and then she gets adopted into this notorious gang of thieves, and they have this plan to overthrow the empire because the empire is currently being ruled by a tyrant and there's a huge amount of the population enslaved. That's the basic premise of this book, but it's so much more, and you realize that when you read Sanderson because he is so articulate and so detailed, and that's what really makes these books stand out, even though they have a kind of generic plotline, in at least in the first book. Even if you're finding these books slow, I really encourage you to read on because his endings are the most satisfying endings I have ever read. So I adore these books. I adore the characters, the relationships, I enjoy the politics. I will say The Well of Ascension is a lot more slower in pace in comparison to Mistborn, and that's because there's a lot more politics going on in this, but I love Well of Ascension just as much. What I personally love about The Well of Ascension is that a lot of the characters who were side characters or minor characters in the first book, they become a lot more central to the overall plot, and we get to learn a lot more about them, like particularly Breeze, and he ended up becoming my favorite character, like one of them. We also learn a lot more about the creatures of the world. We are introduced to them in Mistborn, but we really don't know much about them. I thought it was a really great sequel, but I know a lot of people say that they don't like it as much as Mistborn because it's slower, but I highly recommend you to continue on because again, the ending, when you get to the end, it is so satisfying and you're going to want to pick up the last book, The Hero of Ages, immediately. 5 out of 5 stars if you can't tell. I then buddy read The Last Wish with my friend Lucy from Crescent Pages, and we were both extremely disappointed by this. We went into this with, I feel like, pretty high expectations. Like, we were both very excited and we had both picked it up together because we were anticipating the Netflix TV show, but I was a little bit apprehensive going in the first place because this is a collection of short stories and short stories don't typically work for me. I much prefer a longer book than a short story collection. However, that wasn't my problem with this book, which kind of threw me off a bit. So there was a couple of issues. My first issue was every short story we were introduced to so many new characters. They weren't there in the story for long, and so many of them were really irrelevant. I found it really difficult to keep track of each character, especially because we're given very little description about them. And that was a huge problem that I found for a lot of the book, that there was a lack of description overall and a lack of detail. I'm guessing most of you know what this is about. It does follow a man who is a witcher, and his role in this world is killing and hunting monsters. Monsters in this world, there was very little description on what they looked like, and it was really difficult for me to picture them. These creatures were creatures that I haven't read about before. And there was like a vampire, and that's like easy to picture, but like the Straga, I couldn't really visualize, and we were given very little detail about them. I also strongly disliked how this book portrayed women. It was very misogynistic. There is literally a character in here, actually his name is Dandelion, and I think in the TV show he's the bard, so they've changed his character a bit, but when he wants to make a wish, it's basically to rape a woman that he fancies. Like, that's just one example, but there are multiple times where I was very, very uncomfortable with the portrayal of women. I also thought the characters weren't very well developed, and because of that I was never really attached to the story or attached to the characters. I'm unsure if I should continue on with the series. I have heard that the second book has a different translator, so let me know if it gets better, because I really didn't like this, but I'm so conflicted because I wanted to like this so much, and I have since watched the TV show and I did really enjoy the TV show a lot more. It does have a couple of issues, but I think overall it was a lot better than this. I gave this 1.5 stars in the end. I then read Paper Towns by John Green. It's actually been such a long time since I read a John Green book, and I was a really huge fan of his books in high school. I really liked how borderline philosophical his books got. He asked questions and explored some sort of themes like, what does it mean to be me, and what does it mean to be alive, which is something like, you know, your typical angsty teen asked herself a bit. This book follows Quentin, and he's lived next door to this girl called Margot since they were children. They were quite close as children, but as they grew up they moved into different crowds, and Margot is this really popular, beautiful girl, and Quentin's basically a nerd. One night Margot climbs in through his window, and she is really adventurous, and she takes him on this like adventure where they go and pull all these pranks on people who have done Margot wrong. The next day Quentin goes to school, and it turns out Margot's gone missing, basically run away, and it's about him trying to get her back and trying to figure out what happened to her and solving the mystery of her. Margot is the entire plot of this book, not that it was much of a plot. I really also didn't like how obsessed Quentin was with this girl. Like, he didn't really have anything else going on for him. Enemy in so many ways of Looking for Alaska. Like, it just kind of felt like Looking for Alaska 2.0, which was my first book I read by John Green, and it was my favorite when I was younger. I think a huge thing of this is I don't relate to these characters or this story. I will also say I have seen the movie for this, and the book and the movie have different endings. I personally preferred the ending in the book. Oh yeah, I gave this 2 stars. It was another disappointment of the month, unfortunately. I don't know if this is dated or outdated, so take it or leave it. I then reread The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I'm sure if you are familiar with BookTube that you are very familiar with this book. This book is so well loved all over BookTube, and I think for very, very good reasons. But this book just has so much depth. Evelyn Hugo, I'm sure you've heard, one of the most, if not the most incredible character I've ever read about, because of how real she feels following her life in this story, and it's her as an old woman retelling her life and her 7 husbands and who was her true love. It's all about her struggle and her climb to fame and what she had to sacrifice for fame. I loved how this talked about so many things that you didn't expect it to have included. She talks about how she was really sexualized and how she used that to get popularity and to grow. I know some people don't like Monique's chapters, so if you don't know, like I said before, the story is actually old Evelyn retelling her story, and she's telling it to Monique, who is a journalist. She is writing Evelyn's bibliography. I felt like Monique was us, the reader, and her learning her story and her feeling Evelyn's impact was what we were feeling. That's how I interpreted it, and I thought it was brilliant. 5 stars. I then read The Memory Keeper's Daughter. Now this book is about a young couple. When the wife is about to give birth, there is a snowstorm and they get locked in. The father is a doctor. It wasn't originally planned for him to deliver the babies, but due to the emergency snowstorm and them not being able to get out and get help, he delivers the children. The mother gives birth to 2 twins, and there's a boy and a girl, and the girl twin has Down syndrome, and because the dad is a doctor, he recognizes it immediately, and he gives the baby to the nurse and tells the nurse to take her to an orphanage because he decides it's best that him and his wife don't keep her. This book is then about their lives. I think it started in like the 1960s, say on the back. and then expanded to, I want to say the 80s, maybe early 90s. Went over a long period of time and we're following their lives, and it's multiple POVs. Dad doesn't actually reveal to the mother that the daughter is alive. He tells her that she died during childbirth, and she goes on thinking that she's lost her child. Little does she know that this child is still alive, and that the nurse, in fact, did not take the child to the orphanage. She decided to keep the child, Phoebe, for herself. I think this book started out with a really interesting premise, but it ended up being about a whole lot of nothing. I think that it was a mistake we didn't get the child with Down syndrome's POV, but very little POV from the nurse, snippets here and there, and her point of view was my favorite. Her and Phoebe's story was definitely the most intriguing to me. I preferred their characters as well. And then we are following the father and his wife and their son, and then growing up feeling like there's a hole in the family because of their child missing. I thought the character of the mum was done so poorly. I think her POV was definitely the main focus of the story. Just the choices that the author made for the character to do was just, I don't understand the point of why she did what she did. And there were times where she was really neglectful of her other child. I was just very underwhelmed with this entire story, and I was expecting it to be a really emotionally driven story that dealt with really complex characters, but it wasn't that. It's one of those books that started out with a really good idea and it just missed the mark. I also gave this book 2 stars. I had so many duds in October. Now we can talk about some books that weren't duds. I then buddy read The Dragon Republic with my friend Jameelah. We loved this. The Dragon Republic, if you do not know, is the sequel to The Puppy War, and I listened to the audiobook of this. I can't say too much about this book in particular, but if you haven't heard of The Puppy War, we are following this girl called Rin, who the family has plans to set her up into a marriage, but in order to escape that marriage, she goes and enlists into a military school. She gets into the top school. The first book follows her journey in the military school, training and learning. The magical abilities in here work when characters take opium and they get high, and then they are like vessels for the gods of the world and they use the gods' power. It's pretty cool. What I really adore about this series is it's a combination of fantasy, history, and mythology. I think it's a really well done blend. I really like the take on war, how the author doesn't shy away from the horrors of war, and how these characters, they have goals, and to achieve their end goal, they will do anything. This book just doesn't shy away from the tough topics. If you are someone who can really handle dark, gory, graphic themes and seeing them, I highly recommend this. Rin is such a fascinating character to read about, because I find that with each book I'm relating to her less and less, but her story isn't any less intriguing. In fact, it's kind of more intriguing because it's just so interesting to learn at what lengths she will go to get what she wants. And the ending of this, oh my goodness, yeah, I'm still not over that. I gave this book 4.75 stars. This was my favorite book of the month, not including rereads, but that was Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This was so good. This book, we are following a thief called Senkia, and she, at the beginning of the novel, is doing this job where she just has to steal this item from a vault. Immediately we introduce to her and we understand that she has this useful magical ability that allows her to understand objects. So she can touch an object and she can understand its make and she can understand its layout. So when she's on this job and she has to open up this vault, she touches the vault and she can immediately know the code to get into the vault. So we follow her. She gets this item that she's stolen, and she has been instructed to give this item, whatever she has stolen, over to her buyer as soon as she's stolen it, without looking at what she has stolen, except of course curiosity gets the best of her and she has a look at what she has stolen. It ends up being a talking key. What? I know. Basically, from there, the story unravels and it's all about the repercussions of that. And then the person who was guarding the vault that she stole from comes into the story. It ends up being about him and her, and just, yeah, all the repercussions of her having this talking key. I buddy read this with Ishi. I think I forgot to say that. She also loved it and gave it 5 stars. I believe she struggled with the first about 80 to 100 pages because there's a lot of, in the beginning, world building, like you're really introduced to the world and kind of the basic plot, and then you get to know the characters after page 100. These characters mean so much to me. I wasn't expecting them to be who they ended up being, which was such a pleasant surprise. Like, you kind of introduced to them and I had a stereotype of who I thought they were going to be, and they were not that. I also really loved the magic in this world. Basically, in this world, objects are scribed. It's kind of steampunkish, but it's a mix of technology and magic. It's so well done. I just highly recommend this. If you are a fan of Brandon Sanderson, I recommend this. It's very similar to his books in terms of the intricate magic system and just amazing characters and amazing plot and just, you know, refined detail. I am dying to see what happens in book 2 because they also teased a sapphic romance at the end. Like, it didn't start, but there was a little tease and a little hint that that's the direction this is going, and I'm excited. The last book I read was a reread, and it was Harry Potter in this beautiful edition. If you haven't seen them, they are stunning. Look at that. Yeah, I just love Harry Potter. One of those books where I can't really review it because I've read it every year since I was very little. It just has so much sentimental value that it's 5 stars. I'm not a reliable reviewer for Harry Potter. Sorry. The last thing I read in October was actually a manga, and it was The Promise Neverland Volume 1. I do not know where I put it, so you just have to have a picture on the screen. I picked this up because I need to get more back into manga. I really enjoyed this, and I need to continue on with this series. We are following a bunch of orphans who live at this orphanage together. When one of the young orphans gets adopted, things start happening. I really like the mystery of it. It's a lot darker than it seems. I know the cover makes it seem very happy and cheerful. That is not the case at all. Don't be misled. But yeah, I really love this. I think I gave it 5 stars. I can't remember. I don't add mangas to my Goodreads red shelf. I need to make a separate shelf, so I can't remember exactly what I gave it, but I think I gave it 5 stars. In my mind, it's a 5 stars, so there. But yeah, I highly recommend that if you want to get more into a manga series. Start with that one. It's great. Those are all the books I completed in October. Please let me know if you have any other thoughts on these, if you've read them or if you are planning to read them. I really hope that you are enjoying whatever you're currently reading, and I will see you next time. Bye!